Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something genuinely intricate. We're trying to trace the evolution of the Korean medieval novella, and we'll be cutting through, centuries of confusing literary terms using D.D. Eliseev's 1977 study as our main guide here.
Yeah, and it's a really essential guide because tracing this specific genre, the novella, in pre-modern Korea, you hit this terminology wall almost
A
immediately.
wall, right?
The traditional Korean terms from the Korean Chosun periods are just so broad. They often group together. It's a completely different kinds of writing. You've got tiny anecdotes right alongside really complex literary narratives.
Exactly. Like trying to categorize, I don't know, modern books using only labels like written stuff and maybe quick notes. It's that vague. And this broad grouping, this terminological fog you mentioned, it's really hidden the timeline, made it hard to see when the real structurally mature novella, the kind focused on humanistic themes, actually showed up.
hmm So our goal here is really to look past those traditional labels. We need to separate the short, almost documentary texts from the narratives that show a much higher level of artistic planning. That moment when writing stops just recording facts and starts creating, an artistic synthesis.
Okay, let's dive into that terminological maze then. The two big terms causing all the debate are seesaw and pilsaw. So why the confusion? Why are scholars divided on what these actually meant back then?
Well, it's fascinating because they do cover similar ground, but often in different eras and with different levels of literary ambition, let's say. If we take Susol first, today it's often translated as story or maybe narrative, but back in the 17th, 18th centuries, it was used incredibly broadly, like for almost any short narrative piece.
Right, and there's the trap for us now looking back. We might hear seesaw and think novel, like the modern novel. But that's totally wrong for the medieval period, isn't it? If every little piece of prose gets called the seesaw, you haven't actually defined the novella as something distinct.
Precisely. It just lumps everything together. Now, if we look earlier, back to the Korean and early Chosun times, we find the term pilsul. This one's older, pops up maybe around the 12th century. It translates more like belles lettres or literary notes, and pilsul was generally more documentary in nature.
Documentary, how?
Well, it often pulled its material straight from official histories or maybe personal jottings, diaries, or even those collections of anecdotes people shared, the yadam.
Okay, so Peelsaw sounds like collected notes, anecdotes, maybe historical tidbits. If it's mostly documentary, why is it hard to draw a clean line between that and the actual novella?
Because the line just isn't clean. That's the heart of this whole terminological mess. Some of the really important works that feel structurally like early novellas, they have that modern feel in how they treat character. Even those were often classified by people at the time under that older, broader Pilsol label.
Wait, really? So a text could be doing something totally new, structurally advanced, but still get stuck with an old, sort of inadequate label?
Absolutely. Take Kim Sissup's major work from the 15th century, Kimo Sinhwa, New Stories from Mount Kimo. It's a landmark text. People point to it constantly as the starting point for the mature genre in Korea. But even Kim Sinhwa, in its day, was frequently just called Pilsul.
Wow. Okay, that's crucial then. So the literary scene back then, basically through tiny anecdotes, Sisol or Pilsol, and these really sophisticated, plot-driven early novellas into the same bucket. The terminology itself kind of hid the birth of this serious literary form, so we have to ignore the label and look at the actual architecture of the story.
Exactly. Since the labels don't really help us differentiate, we have to define the genre by, its internal workings. What is it structurally that makes a novella different from just a simple anecdote? The kind that might sum up a whole life in a few lines.
Yeah, it seems to boil down to focus and intention. The study points out three key things that really define the true genre. First one is concentration. The novella zooms in on one specific crucial episode, an isolated decisive moment, or maybe a tight chain of events that form the core conflict.
And that focus, that zooming in, is pretty revolutionary for the time. Think about it. An anecdote might mention someone's birth, skip ahead, mention their death, summarizing decades. The novella cuts all that noise out. It focuses only on the crisis point or the specific conflict, which means the plot itself becomes much denser, much more organized. It skips the fluff and gets right to the moment that defines the character's fate.
And focusing on that crisis moment, that naturally leads to the second point, right? The specific type of protagonist. It's not just some generic king or a symbol of virtue. The novella depicts a definite type of life. It features a character who represents a certain kind of person.
Yes. That's a huge leap from earlier stuff, Older historical prose often had figures who were just their title or what they achieved externally. The novella makes you understand the type of person are they, a merchant, a frustrated scholar, a woman defying expectations. And that kind of specific character demands a story that actually explores why they do what they do, their inner motivations.
Which, I guess, gets us to the third, maybe the most critical difference.
Okay.
The deep dive into the personal fate, the inner conflict, the psychology of that individual.
That's exactly it. If an anecdote just says, General Yi fought bravely and won, that's just external action. A novella asks, okay, how did General Yi grapple with his fear before the battle? What moral compromises did he have to make to secure that win? The story digs into the consequences for the person's soul, not just the outcome for the kingdom.
So this whole shift means the novella needs a much higher level of artistic organization,
Yeah.
right? It's moving away from just presenting raw historical facts or folklore. It's aiming for an artistic synthesis, a realistic image, as Eliseev puts it, built entirely on plot, not just summarizing known events. The form itself had to evolve because the writers wanted to say something deeper about being human.
Absolutely. The complexity of the form had to catch up with the complexity of the ideas they were trying to express.
Okay, this is where the timeline gets really interesting for me. We know there was narrative prose way back 4th to 6th centuries in things like Samguk Sagi, Samguk Yusa, great historical accounts, but you called them precursors. So when does Korean literature start hitting all three of those structural marks we just laid out, the concentration, the specific character type, the inner psychology?
Well, the consensus and what the study supports is that the true artistic novella genre, defined by that structure and depth, really starts to take shape around the 15th century, mid-Josh period. And yeah, we keep coming back to Kim Si-sup and Kim Il-sung because his work really does seem to represent that decisive break. The moment collection turns into deliberate artistic form.
And Alicia's study offers that really helpful roadmap, doesn't it? That four-stage periodization, showing how the genre grew and changed from the 12th century all the way to the 19th.
It does. It's a useful framework. Stage 1, covering the 12th and 13th centuries, is what he calls the preparatory stage. This is where you see those pхэсоль collections gathering the raw material. It's more documentation than art, really.
Just collecting stories, anecdotes.
Pretty much. Then stage 2, the 14th through 16th centuries, is the stage of origin and formation. This is the crucial transition. You get writers like Kim Sev who start consciously shaping the material, focusing on plot, really digging into the character's internal world.
Okay, so the engine, the structure, is basically built and running by the time we hit stage 3.
Exactly right. Stage 3, the 17th and 18th centuries, is the stage of flourishing. This is the golden age for the Korean novella. The major works are created, the artistic quality is arguably at its peak, and the form is being fully used to explore complex ideas.
And then finally,
Finally, stage 4 is the 19th century, which is marked as the stage of decline or transition. The form starts to kind of morph, maybe lose some of its distinctiveness, and eventually gives way to the modern novel and other literary trends.
okay, so if structure is the engine, let's talk about the fuel, the ideas. What kind of democratic or humanistic ideas were packed into these novellas during that flourishing period, the 17th, 18th centuries? Ideas that just weren't there in the older historical notes or simple folktales.
Well, fundamentally, the novella became a space for some pretty radical thinking for the time. Literature before this, by and large, was expected to reinforce the official ideology. Confucian values, loyalty to the king, social harmony, duty. The novella, though, offered one of the first serious literary platforms to question some of that.
How so? What themes pop out?
The biggest shift was towards centering the individual. The genre started exploring things like personal happiness, romantic love that wasn't arranged by families, the idea of individual freedom. Imagine reading a story back then where a commoner or maybe a frustrated scholar is shown openly struggling against the rigid rules of the feudal system. That kind of content was genuinely revolutionary.
And focusing on someone's personal fate, their inner struggles. That almost automatically leads to a critique of the system, doesn't it? It's hard to explore personal freedom without bumping up against the things limiting it.
Absolutely. Instead of characters who are just defined by their official rank or status, you start seeing everyday people, sometimes commoners, sometimes intellectuals on the fringes. And the story revolves around their internal moral compass, their choices, their suffering. Even when these novellas used elements of fantasy or myth, and they often did, that fantasy was usually a tool to explore a very real, very human internal problem. It was a deliberate move towards a realistic portrayal of human conflict, not just a record of heroic deeds or supernatural events.
Right. So that brings us to a pretty neat conclusion then. The Korean medieval novella, even though its emergence was kind of masked by those vague catch-all terms like seesaw and pillsol, it's actually a really distinct, historically vital literary genre.
It absolutely is. It's defined by that sharp focus on a single decisive event or crisis. And it's crucial because it was one of the first literary forms in Korea to really champion the individual's inner life, their psychology, and even early democratic or humanistic ideals. It shows that the literary form itself evolved precisely because writers needed a vehicle to carry these new, more complex, sometimes challenging ideas.
Yeah, this whole deep dive really underlines how studying literary form isn't just some dry academic exercise. It's actually a key way to track how ideas and ideologies were changing within a society. The novella essentially carved out this legitimate, sophisticated literary space where the lives and feelings of ordinary people, or at least people outside the absolute elite, could be taken seriously and depicted realistically for perhaps the first time.
Hmm. Which does leave us with a pretty interesting question for you, the listener, to think about. Given that this genre, the novella, was carrying such potent, even radical ideas, personal happiness, individual freedom, questioning authority, all within a very strict hierarchical feudal society, how much did this literary revolution actually influence real-world change in Korea during its peak in the 17th and 18th centuries? Did these stories just stay on the pages as entertainment, or did they genuinely start to shift how people thought, maybe even subtly influencing society or politics? Food for thought. Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.